We will start with Dr. Ariana Curtis.
All right, it's going to be a little bit tricky with me balancing the mic, the slides, and the paper, so bear with me. So before he became the first Black secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, and before he became the founding director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, Lonnie Bunch wrote an essay about the absence of racial diversity in the museum field, Flies in the Buttermilk. Museum's diversity and the will to change. It was originally published in summer 2000. Since so little has changed, it was republished in May 2019. This is the milk. I often begin presentations with this sobering data from the 2017 Art Museum Demographic Survey, and the second two stats are 2022 staff updates following the racial reckoning of 2020. In his essay, Lonnie observed that many of the people of color who attended the gathering, talking about an AAM conference, represented racially or ethnic-specific institutions. These institutions may be considered marginal in the field. We know, however, that the work is anything but. We are not represented in this data. And while it's important to understand the state of the field, it's also important to understand that this is not our reality. So I am elated that the specificity and exception of Black museums brings us together today. January 2023 made 10 years that I'd worked at the Smithsonian Institution. And despite spending most of my professional life at the world's largest museum education and research complex, I rarely feel like a fly in the buttermilk. I have only worked in its Black museum spaces. And I always say that with a smile and frankly some amazement that such a career is even possible. I agree that mainstream museums must diversify, and not just racially, to remain trustworthy and relevant. I do work for a predominantly white institution, but diversifying white spaces is not my primary job. I relish in the reality that as a Black cultural worker in 2023, I have real choices about where I work. I have proudly made an unusual career, but fulfilling career, curating Latinidad in the Smithsonian's Black museum spaces. Contemporary movements led by non-white cultural workers call for the decolonization of museums and the acknowledgement that museums are not neutral. Thinking again about the museum field as a whole versus Black museums, I would argue that the myth of museum neutrality never applied to us. And this is going to echo a little bit of what Delphine has already laid out. But the National Black Museum movement, as part of Black political activism, created multiple African American museums and predominantly history museums. So I just want to read some of them to give you an idea of the naming conventions of the time. So the first independent African American museum, then known as Afro-American Cultural and Historical Society Museum in Cleveland, Ohio, was founded in 1953. The DuSable Museum of African American History in Chicago, founded in 1961. The International Afro-American Museum, now the Charles H. Wright Museum in Detroit, 1965. The Smithsonian Anacostia Neighborhood Museum in Washington, D.C., 1967. The African American Museum in Philadelphia, founded in 1976. Right, so again, this is not an exhaustive list, but rather notable museums that were part of this concerted Black museum movement. Notice Anacostia did not have some version of African American in its name. It is the only community museum in the Smithsonian system. It did not always have an explicitly African American mission. However, by focusing on its neighborhood communities and Washington, D.C. in general, the museum's visual and cultural identity, like the city at the time, was predominantly Black. In 2003, when legislation passed for Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, Anacostia's mission transitioned from de facto African American to urban communities with a focus on the DC metro area. So when and where I formally enter Black museum spaces is January 2013, Anacostia, a radical space of Black innovation in an otherwise risk-averse national museum system. I was hired through a Smithsonian-wide Latino curatorial initiative. So Smithsonian museums and centers applied for funding to hire Latinx scholars focused on Latinidad. So I'm the only Black person in my cohort, and I am now one of the, if not the only Afro-Latina curator at the Smithsonian Institution. My 4 years at Anacostia were whirlwind, impactful, productive, life-changing, but difficult. I had lived in the DC area for a decade before starting at Anacostia. So I was familiar with the multiracial Latinx population, the sizable Black Caribbean population, and the fact that the DC area is home to the second largest African immigrant and first-gen population in the United States. DC is a city of Black diversity. However, on my first day, I realized that Anacostia operationally defined Blackness as African American. Right, so that definition disconcertingly excluded Latinidad, which is what I was hired to do, but it was also antithetical to the work that I knew from Anacostia. Among other Black Latinx inclusive exhibitions, in 2009, Anacostia hosted the traveling exhibition, The African Presence in Mexico, and in the 1990s had a landmark research project and exhibition of their own, Black Mosaic, Community, Race, and Ethnicity Among Black Immigrants in Washington, D.C. I have written previously about how some African American staff members did not initially receive me as a fellow Black person because I'm Latina. Additionally, museum leadership referred to Anacostia's pre-2003 collection as the, quote, African American Legacy Collection. The label African American was not popularly used until the 1980s, and we erase Black nuance when we retroactively apply that term where it may not fit. Black museums as sites of justice have always included Black diversity. I call Anacostia a Black museum with intention. During the Black Museum movement, the intrinsic acknowledgement of our linked fate as Black people and Black institutions was never an afterthought or future relationships to cultivate, but rather fundamental to how we construct we, right? This is who we've always been. Blackness in DC includes Latinidad. Anacostia's archives include Latinidad. So as curator for Latino studies, I do not see myself as having created something new. I cultivated an understudied part of Black museology's legacy and showcased overlooked parts of Anacostia's institutional history and material collections to better align our work with the demographic and expectations of our community and the demographics and expectations of our staff. So for me, that work included building shared language. So my first major project was a conference about Blackness and immigration in celebration of the 20th anniversary of Anacostia's Black Mosaic exhibition. I also sought out to reinterpret existing collections. So Derek Webster is a part of Anacostia's, quote, African American folk art collection. Born and raised in Belize, he moved to Chicago as an adult, and that is his work on the far left. The 2016 show, The Backyard of Derek Webster's Imagination, was the first time his Caribbean-themed sculptures were exhibited. I also sought to create new narratives through exhibitions. So I curated 2 bilingual exhibitions, Bridging the Americas, about Panamanians in the Washington, D.C. area. And that signature image is from the Black Mosaic collection in the Anacostia archives. And Gateways Portales, that got cut off a little bit, about Latinx communities in growing urban centers like Washington, D.C. Gateways actually won honorable mention in the Smithsonian's Excellence in Exhibition Awards. Anacostia is the smallest Smithsonian museum with one of the smallest staffs and probably the lowest budget. So that win was a testimony to the quality and importance of innovative community-informed work, a hallmark of Black museums. The museum has since changed how it defines Blackness, how it talks about itself, and how it imagines community. I consider my critiques of Anacostia, published in the Public Historian, a calling in and not a calling out. We shared years of internal conversations before they were ever made public. And when I think about my work there, I envision Sankofa. The abundance of Anacostia's own history allows us to return to a space where Latinx inclusive Black futures are possible. In 2017, I joined the staff of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. A section of the exhibition, A Changing America, 1968 and Beyond, which is not what you're looking at, sorry, is dedicated to the Black Museum movement. The Smithsonian African American Museum, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture on the National Mall is only possible because Black people had the audacity to create a network of Black museums in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. As a 21st century museum, we are expanding public understandings about what is African American and about Black American diversity, including Black Latinidad. We are the only African American museum to have a curatorial position dedicated to Latinx studies. And if that's not radical possibility, I don't know what is. We position Latinidad as integral to the intellectual and material foundation of this new Black institution. Black museums create our own frameworks and help people understand the power of that self-articulation. Nowhere is that clearer for me than having the opportunity and the time to dream up a curatorial framework and then the resources to make that a reality. As a young museum, we are aggressively increasing the museum's collection. So my curatorial contributions, Latinidad through an African American lens, has 5 collecting areas, and none of these areas are mutually exclusive. So I'll just say that I can talk about collections forever, and I'm not. So I'm gonna just really briefly show you one thing from each area and move on. So for Latinx, so people often ask, what would be considered Latinx that's not Afro-Latinx that would interest the National Museum of African American History and Culture? So this is Mariano Rivera's jersey. Mariano Rivera, Panamanian closer for the Yankees, does not identify as black. He's not Afro-Panamanian. We have this jersey because MLB retired Jackie Robinson's 42 across the entire league, and he was the last player to wear that number. Afro-Latinx, if you haven't recognized, I'm Panamanian, so I always try and include Panamanian images in everything that I do. So here's a black Panamanian girl in New York dressed in full pollera. And this is US Afro-Latinx because she is not in Panama, right? She is in New York. And so it's important to talk about the groundedness of US Latinx, Afro-Latinx populations in the United States, not always thinking about Latin America. Representing African American and Afro-Latinx, you literally see a Young Lords pin and a Black Panthers pin next to each other. And this photo is from Hiram Aristani, who was the official photographer of the Young Lords Party in New York. For Diaspora, this boat seat is from Esmeraldas, Ecuador, a black community in Ecuador, and it's carved with a spider web and a spider representing Anansi, right? So we're not a diaspora museum. We don't often collect from outside of the United States. We don't just collect anything that black people create. The connection to African American history and culture is that spider web and spider, right? Anansi is that connection. And lastly, African Americanness in Latin America. So this poster was designed by Cuban designer Lázaro Abreu, but he's using the artwork of Emory Douglas, right, in this poster. And so it's, the circulations of African Americanness and Latin American. And I also think it's just interesting to understand international perspectives and solidarity with African American people. So that's one from each thing in record time. So as a curator and scholar, my priority at the National Museum of African American History and Culture is the same as it was at Anacostia, to present black people, history, and culture as multidimensional, multicultural, multi-ethnic, and global. This representation matters for how society sees and understands black people, and it matters for how we, as black people, see and understand ourselves. I'm never talking about the intellectual and strategic work of building Latinx studies at 2 very different black museums. I want to shift, though, to talk about how it feels. I used the title Spaces of Care to explicitly acknowledge the ethics of care through which black museums display black life and the emotional safety black museums can provide. So I was giving a tour, this is 2017. I was giving a tour of gateways for local Latinx educators. And I turned to a group of women to discuss something, and I noticed that they were all in tears. It's like, what happened? I asked frantically. But it was nothing and everything. They were overcome with emotion seeing bilingual Latinx representation of our local history and communities, centering black folks in the Smithsonian. And what they felt in response was more than what they wanted to keep inside. I'm not, an overtly public displays of emotion person, but I had a little dust in my eye that day. And for more reasons than I have time to explain, I perform a lot of institutional service. Anna Julia Cooper's When and Where I Enter, as I use to title this section, references the armor I carry into non-black spaces. So for those unfamiliar with the quote, only the black woman can say when and where I enter, in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence and without suing or special patronage, then and there, the whole Negro race enters with me. In 2018, I was one of NAMAC, that's how we shorten National Museum of African American History and Culture. I was one of NAMAC's representatives on the predominantly white Smithsonian American Women's Collections Book Committee. We cannot fight every fight in these spaces, right? We have to be strategic about how and when we expend our energy. So as the only Afro-Latina, one day I just said, all the Latinas in the book are mostly white and none of them are black. I advocated successfully for the inclusion of the Queen of Salsa, Celia Cruz. We couldn't have what do I want to say diplomatically and carefully? It's a collections book. And so the Women's History Initiative was just launching, and we understood that we under-collected from women, period, and certainly had under-collected from women of color. But because it was a collections book, we could only feature women if we already had collections. So Celia Cruz is in actually 5 different Smithsonian Museum collections. So she got a full-page spread. I wrote the long essay, which is a very short essay. She was part of the book's promotional stories, a highlight for the book's programming, and I considered that a win. So this is how she's represented in our 2 Black museums. So I collected this portrait of her, Celia con Rolos, by Dominican artist Tony Peralta, and that is her dress that's part of the inaugural exhibition, Musical Crossroads. So I considered just her being in the book a win. But then the US Mint partnered with the Congressional Caucus for Women's Issues, the National Women's History Museum, and the Smithsonian American Women's History Initiative on the American Women's Quarters program. So remembering my passionate advocacy, they asked me if I would write a letter in support of Celia Cruz. And while I lauded her 7-decade career full of all of the highest awards and spoke about her costumes, colorful wigs, and signature refrain, Azúcar, I also provided the necessary social context to understand her excellence. We are just now having public conversations about colorism and anti-Blackness in Latinidad. Born in 1925, a little over a decade after a massacre of Black people in Cuba, Celia Cruz was a dark-skinned, Spanish-speaking Black immigrant woman who stomped on the gender barriers of salsa and made a career in a racist, sexist, anti-immigrant United States and became a global icon. In 2024, she will be the first Black Latina on US currency. I saw the story explode in Spanish language news before I saw it in English. And my name is rarely mentioned. The quotes from my letter are actually attributed to the US Mint, right? But this quarter does not happen without Ana Castia requesting a curator for Latinx Studies in 2011, or the prestige of the National Museum of African American History and Culture that ensured my space on that book's editorial committee, where I first raised her unapologetic Black excellence. This quarter does not happen without my nourishing and revitalizing home base of a Black museum that provides the affirmation and stamina to constantly push back. So these are some of the designs that they first floated out for the quarter, and that is her portrait in the National Portrait Gallery. So despite my frequent recitation of Toni Morrison's, "You are not the work that you do, you are the person that you are," the personal-professional division is porous. This quarter is tangible proof that our efforts matter. But the reality is, most of our work in non-Black spaces is uncredited emotional labor, sometimes at high personal risk. The public resignations of Black women like Kelly Morgan and Leslie Loco modeled self-care and bravery. I'm not pretending that walking into a Black museum will transport you to Wakanda. As Dr. Tressie McMillan Cotton says, the institution cannot love you, and that includes Black institutions. But our bodies know that it is an act of resistance and vulnerability to bring our full Black selves to the workplace or any place. And so I want us to think about how Black museums make us feel. Great museums are not just about being people-centered or racially inclusive, accessible, interactive, or academically sound. I want to name safety, physical, emotional, intellectual, as critical to any liberatory museum praxis. And so for me and for my work, Black museums have been spaces of care. Museums boast that they are rated the most trustworthy source of information in the US, and I've always been at odds with that statement because we know museums are profoundly flawed institutions born of racist colonial legacies, and yet we trust them deeply. Although not exempt from public criticism or public accountability, Black museums have always been interventionist. Their mere existence calls out systemic Black exclusion from mainstream cultural institutions. Black museums are sites of justice and hope by design. M.K. Jemisin writes, "I think one of the most radical things anyone in this world can do is imagine that Black people have a future." Black museums exist for Black futures. We collect, interpret, display, and preserve. We create spaces for all expressions of our existence. Black museums are tools to advance a historically informed Black consciousness and affirm for all who enter that Black lives do indeed matter. To the mainstream museum searching for relevance by shifting from collections focus to people focus, trying to reinterpret their past narratives to signal a more inclusive future, we say, welcome. These tenets and methods of Black museums are moving from the margins to the center of standard museum practice. And with them, Black histories and Black art are moving from the margins to the center of standard museum practice. More slowly moving are Black publics, Black visitors, Black cultural workers. in essence, Black people, adding more flies to the buttermilk. Fellow anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston famously said, "I feel most colored when I'm thrown against a sharp white background." But because that's not our background, we are able to feel differently. For us, Blackness is the context for all that we do and the center of who we do it for. So just a very special thank you to Gayla and to Delphine for inviting me here and for giving me a reason to think about why Black museums. I'm honored to be part of this inaugural event, celebrating the audacity of Black people, not just to imagine a more just society, but to help create it. The global network of Black museums guarantees multiple safe spaces of radical possibilities for us to learn and to be and to dream together. Thank you.